Hey everybody, this is Professor Ross, and I'd like to talk to you a little bit about um, the edTPA's expectations with regard to academic language, and specifically the four areas of academic language that they talk about. So I'm in our classroom page here, and under classwork, I've got a category called edTPA materials, and hopefully these are useful things for you that you're able to make use of and have used some of these. But I'm going to point out I've got some academic language handouts. They're going to be really useful in this last section of the course. And right now I want to look at this one called Understanding Academic Language in edTPA. It's a PDF that edTPA has put out about academic language. And let's just take a look at the main idea here. Academic language is the oral and written language used for academic purposes. So it's the language of the discipline used to engage students in learning, and it includes the means by which students develop and express content understanding. So it's not just everyday language, but it's language tied to a discipline and used for academic purposes for learning. So when you're completing your edTPA, you must consider the academic language, the language demands present throughout the learning segment in order to support student learning and language development. And part of that process means you're going to have to assess students' use of academic language, and it includes four aspects: function, vocabulary or symbols, discourse, and syntax. So let's take a look at the definition of each of those to see if we can get a sense of what they mean by those four things. First, language function. It's the purpose for which language is used. So in your classroom, why are you speaking? Why are your students speaking? They're trying to learn something. What are they trying to learn? That's what the language function is all about. And the language function is often represented by the active verbs within the learning outcomes. So we focus a lot on writing clear learning outcomes for any lesson. If you look at those learning outcomes and you look at the active verb in the outcome, that's what we mean by language function. This document has a bunch of different examples of those kinds of things in different areas. I recommend that you check out this document and look at the different examples in your licensure area. What's vocabulary? Vocabulary includes words, phrases, and symbols used within disciplines. They have three categories of vocabulary: words and phrases with subject-specific meanings that differ from meanings used in everyday life. I can think in mathematics, for example, we might use the word angle to mean something different than you might mean in everyday life. It might have a very specific meaning in geometry, for example. Vocabulary can also be general academic vocabulary across disciplines, and then also subject-specific words and or symbols defined for use in the discipline. And so those are ones that are defined specifically within your discipline and don't really have any meaning outside your discipline. Once again, they've got a lot of examples here of vocabulary that you can check out. The last two are maybe a little trickier to get a sense of. The third one here is discourse. It is how members of the discipline talk, write, and participate in knowledge construction using the structures of written and oral language. So discipline-specific discourse has distinctive features or ways of structuring oral or written language to represent knowledge visually. So this is kind of, you think about your area, your history licensure major. How do historians tend to talk to each other? How do they tend to write? How do they tend to make arguments and convince each other of things? And in general, build up what they consider to be valuable knowledge in their area. The way historians do that is probably kind of different from the way literature specialists do or mathematicians do. So each area has its own tendencies and ways of using language that you want to get familiar with. And once again, there's some examples there for you to check out. Lastly, syntax. And I'll contrast this with discourse in a second, but syntax are the rules for organizing words or symbols together into phrases, clauses, sentences, or visual representations. One of the main functions of syntax is to organize language in order to convey meaning. I think of syntax as a smaller scale thing than discourse. Discourse is kind of big, the big picture, what they're talking about. Syntax is kind of small. What's the nitty gritty of how we tend to phrase things or put words and symbols together? And so there might be some very discipline specific kinds of things, like in science, there's a certain way you organize symbols to represent elements and molecules that conveys meaning in a specific way. And if somebody mixes up those symbols, then they don't understand the syntax and they can't convey meaning very effectively. The way you might do that in chemistry is really different than the way you might use symbols in a logic class or something like that. So there's different kinds of symbol use and organization, but these are kind of within a sentence. How do we tend to construct things? Once again, there's a bunch of examples for you to check out that could be helpful. So those are our 4 main areas that you want to get real familiar with: function, vocabulary, discourse, and syntax. Hope this video has been helpful in you getting a little bit of an understanding in those 4 areas.